and welcome to another episode of the Pathfinder Report, a podcast brought to you by Project Pathfinder. Today, I'm joined in the studio by Mr. Joel Gruey and Mr. Glenn Birch. Today, we will be talking about the situation in Minneapolis. Now, there's been a lot of talk about what's going on there. A lot of footage has shown up. There's facts, there's conjecture, but at the time of this recording, there's been no official court hearing, if I'm correct. So we're talking today less about what has happened, because that's been done to death, and you can go to a million different news outlets and find information on that and do your own research. But what we're talking about today are the principles that are at play right now in this whole situation as it's developed. And we are going to cover some of the principles and takeaways that we should walk away from a situation like this with. Who would like to go first?
Glenn, feel free to dig deeper on this, because I think there's at least a particular functional component of government that's coming into play here that is creating a lot of tension. And it's going to require a little bit of nerding out to understand a particular thing, an aspect of government that's kind of at the heart of what's generating some of this. What we're dealing with in Minneapolis is broad spectrum operations by law enforcement, right? Okay. Now, as a rule, most of the time that we see law enforcement operating in the U.S., federal or state or local, it tends to be what we traditionally understand as precisely targeted. Okay, an individual is being arrested or being sought after for participation or presumptive participation in a crime, or being arrested for some sort of charge. Occasionally, it's an entire company or an entire entity of some kind, but it generally is a precise application of law enforcement. Those are undergirded in our society and usually targeted by a warrant, right? That's what most people know of. So it's like you go to a judge, like a prosecutor wants to have someone arrested, or a law enforcement wants to arrest someone for perceived criminal activity. They go to a judge. The judge says, yeah, I think that actually works, or no, I don't think you have enough evidence for this. They sign off on it, and then off the police go to do their job of basically acquiring the person and bringing them in to go through due process. That's what we traditionally understand in terms of judicial law enforcement. That uses what's called a judicial warrant, which means the warrant goes to the judge signs off on it. What we're seeing in Minneapolis, or Operation Metro Surge is what they're calling it, Minneapolis, kind of the broader area, is in employing a different device called an administrative warrant. Okay, this is something that can be issued in certain circumstances by certain judges or employees of the federal government, or basically like entities in it, that specifically work in certain ways. They aren't judicially reviewed in many cases. They don't actually go before a judge. And they allow certain actions and not others. And frankly, they're not something that society commonly runs into. We don't see these used regularly. They basically get to be used in like one or two very rare exceptions. And usually they are not used relative to citizens who people presume to have citizenship status, okay? Which kind of goes to a couple of our principles here. One of them is innocent until proven guilty and due process. So two of the different principles that kind of come into play as we're looking at the situation. But right now we're seeing a lot of these administrative warrants being used by ICE to do different operations targeting, or more broadly targeting, maybe. That's kind of one of the issues that's coming into play here. Presumed illegal aliens, generally speaking, non-citizens without legal residency status of some kind. That is kind of the big broad category. That's not quite how it's working out in practice, though. But that's kind of the big, the thing, and some of the two of the principles that are coming into play here right now.
Yeah, and to me, the one that I wanted, Joel touched on this a little bit, but one of the things that really is kind of being hit with some of the stuff that's going on right now is the innocent until proven guilty side of stuff and the due process that comes along with that. And in some places in Minneapolis, it moved from a targeted, we have reason to believe that this person is here illegally, and therefore we're going to detain them and go through the deportation process, to there was almost an assumption that people were illegal unless they could prove their citizenship. And that is the opposite of the way that our criminal justice system is supposed to operate, is whoever the prosecuting authority is, whether that's the federal government, whether that's a state or local government, they are the ones that have the burden of proof to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this crime has been committed and this person, the suspect, actually committed the crime. And we're seeing some of that get flipped on its head with the idea of going up to people just randomly at a gas station, walking down a street, not targeted them because there's reason to believe that they're here illegally, but going up to them and basically saying, prove you're a citizen. And so that's one of the problems with the way that ICE has been doing some of the enforcement in Minneapolis specifically. There have been other places where ICE has been doing the traditional side of, we have done investigations. We believe that this person, and we have reasons to believe this person is here illegally and has violated our laws. And so then we go and arrest them and begin the judicial process with that. And that's the way it's supposed to go. But in Minneapolis, there was a lot of points where it kind of veered away from how it's supposed to be done into a round up as many people as possible. And if we get people who aren't illegal, hopefully that will get sorted out later, which is not the way that our judicial system and our justice system is actually supposed to operate.
Correct. Now, I should note, there are actually places in U.S. law where you are allowed to detain someone for essentially reasonable suspicion, just cause, okay, or like exigent circumstance, et cetera. There's actually ways that you can legally and lawfully and appropriately detain someone for suspected criminal activity. And those are actually in U.S. code. Okay, so for example, if you live within 100 miles of the U.S. border, Canada, Mexico being traditional, but wherever that is, so within 100 miles, there's a buffer zone that's actually in law that's been reviewed by courts that allows a kind of a on balance of facts and judgment of agents to be able to intervene. Now, for the record, Minneapolis is 317 miles away from the Canadian border, so it's outside of that 100-mile zone. But there is actually a zone that permits that. Okay, for I think it's mostly for border patrol and not so much ICE. So there are some exceptions to that. If you see a crime being actively committed, obviously you can intervene at that point. And the administrative warrants are allowed to be able to be used in the case where you have a, generally speaking, precise reason to believe there's a high level of flight risk. That generally requires someone actually meeting that standard. And that's the part that's proven to be particularly complicated, is finding evidence that that is being precisely and specifically done rather than just saying we're painting with a broad brush. That, again, it moves from broad spectrum action to precise action. And we find justice, at least traditionally in America, justice has always been an instrument that's supposed to be precise, where it specifically looks at people as individuals rather than looking at them as categories. I think that tension has been around in the U.S. for a very long time. And we have found that we, generally speaking, err historically and culturally when we put people in categories rather than dealing with people as individuals. The individual aspect is better. Now, there is a philosophical basis underneath that where you get people that would rather deal with people by groups and classes. And we see this all the time in culture. We already see people where it's like, oh, you're one of insert classification or grouping, and therefore someone is dismissed or automatically accepted or applauded or basically booed because they're put in a group or a class. In a sense, we're seeing that same bad behavior that happens in culture, or at least we may be seeing that bad behavior that happens in culture being played out in a law enforcement mechanism, which can be very, very dangerous for a variety of reasons. Law is not a place for imprecise or broad spectrum action. It's something that should be done in precise, calibrated, and specifically accountable ways, which is one of the parts of due process that it provides accountability for government action, because each action is individually looked at.
Right. So with all this being said about how government is supposed to be precise, how law enforcement is supposed to be precise, how our judicial system should work, and that there are some exceptions for stuff like what's happening, but not exactly what's happening. That's the law enforcement side of the coin, but we've also seen a bunch of chatter in the Pathfinder Discord about what the correct side of protesting looks like. Like if we're supposed to side with law enforcement, because a lot of people want to support law enforcement because they do help keep our country safe. They are the domestic protection. But
Right.
at the same time, if we just allow that to grow more powerful than what it should be, then how do we protest that? So, would you guys mind weighing in on what the civil liberties and civil protest should look like in like a functioning society, or at least functioning well in America?
So let me start with this blanket statement of the fact that it is appropriate for citizens, for Americans to go to their government and say, I don't like this. It needs to be fixed. Now, the way it's fixed is usually a matter of significant debate. In fact, you'll find this often on the left and the right, where you will find large amounts of agreement on problems in society and massive amounts of disagreement on how to address the problems in society, but they will actually generally agree on problems and occasionally even agree on the end state. But the means to get from A to B is where there's a lot of debate. So there's an element of that. Now, this is where we move from prescribed methodology, and there's certain things that are actually straight up legally saying, here's how you engage your government. If that means that you are showing up at their events, if you're communicating with your electeds, if you are actually writing and filing and signing a petition and submitting it to Congress. I was involved in one of those a couple of years ago. We had over 100,000 names signed on a sheet of paper, on mini sheets of paper. But that being said, we actually brought that to Congress. Like, we had boxes of the things. Okay. So in one sense, you can do that, but there is an aspect here that is not it's not a static problem. There's a perception of exigency, like it's an immediate kind of urgent, timely, what is perceived as, I think, a wrongdoing or a bad behavior aspect that needs to be addressed in the immediacy. Those can be addressed in a couple ways. One, you get lower but government actors addressing, pushing back, where you see, for example, a judge that goes, actually, no, we're not going to authorize that. We're going to review this. We're going to intervene and say that's not okay. So you can see the branches holding each other accountable, the legislature, the executive, or the judicial. When that's not working or not easily done, though, you do obviously have the right to protest. And that can be done in terms of public awareness, signage, standing. It can be, you'll see it in terms of parades. I've seen protests in my town. And generally speaking, you can call up the police and say, hey, we're doing a protest here, FYI. And they're like, okay, great. That's good to know. We'd like to not have there be a problem. And so they'll actually set up space so you can do that occasionally and make sure that that's not disruptive. So there's a way to do that that's kind of in the system. There's also a way not to, where you start bumping into other people's rights, their freedom of movement, for example, or if you start destroying or damaging private property, okay, or public property, that's not included in the right to protest. Now, whether there's going to be intervention on that is a question of some debate, but at a certain point, when the protest accelerates in kind of intensity, it can move from a protected speech to, I'm not going to say not protected speech, maybe less protected speech. You start getting multiple factors coming together. Sometimes you'll be in a place where you are doing a protest, which is fine, but what you've done in the process of that protest has gotten you to a place where you are facing other legal consequences for things you did as a result of that. We've historically seen that in the U.S. People I'm going to protest and I'm going to do it in a way that is technically illegal. And historically, when people have chosen to do that, they have understood that when they choose to act in a manner that is contrary to law, to make a point about the improperness of the law, that part of that decision involves saying, and I will bear the consequences that come with that. And there's a long history of that goes way before the U.S. government. In fact, it goes all the way back to early Christians, in fact, other places too, but you see it in some of the most earliest Christianity in the Roman Empire, where they would be like, actually, we're not doing that thing. And we're going to make a point of it, and we will take the consequence that comes with that. And that can be sometimes very severe. But you have to understand that going in. And if you don't understand that going in, you're like, I'm just going to say no, and nothing's going to happen to me as a result. That tends to get you in places that you do not expect really fast. We saw that earlier with a couple of things. Glenn, there's more to it than that. There's more nuance in there. You want to expand on that?
Yeah, there's obviously, and Joel mentioned this, there's the right to protest. And I know both Joel and I have on numerous times gone into DC for the March for Life, which is a massive protest against abortion. And it's thousands and hundreds of thousands of people that come there every year for that. And so that type of stuff is completely legal and is a constitutionally protected thing. But there are limitations, even to use the common legal analogy or example that gets thrown out there, there are limitations on even the freedom of speech. For example, it's not actually proper or allowed or constitutionally protected speech for someone to go into a crowded theater and yell fire when there's no fire, and you're causing then chaos and mayhem because of that. That's not actually constitutionally protected speech. That's a legal framework that's been set up of going, you've got freedom of speech, but even there's some limitations once it gets into the harming other people side of things. And it's the same thing with protests. So it's one thing to protest government actions, and it's even completely fine and legal to be within the realm of where that government action is happening and protesting. But even when the government action is or is viewed to be unjust, there are limitations on what you can do as far as stopping that when you have somebody who does have a badge, does have the authority to issue arrests. There's limitations on what you can legally do with that. And at times, I will say in Minneapolis, from what I've seen, it never moved into the position of rioting. And I think that's one of the complicating things with there, because it wasn't like some of the other places where it went from protest to straight up rioting and breaking into businesses and places and looting and all of that side of stuff. I've not seen stuff out of Minneapolis that had that turning into the rioting, but you did have at times people where they are actually interfering with the ICE officers. And I can understand someone looking at something and going, I think this is unjust, and therefore it's my role to stop it. But legally speaking, that's not actually your role when to stop a government official who does technically have the authority to conduct those arrests. There are legal ways to go about that. You've got the court system that you can go through to try to stop things from happening or undo things that have happened. And so I think that's in Minneapolis, it was getting into some of that murkier side because people were seeing what either is or at least they viewed as an injustice happening. And they were trying to step in to stop something that they viewed as wrong and unjust from actually happening. But there are limitations as to what is that constitutionally protected protest. And you did see times where people moved beyond the constitutionally protected protest into actually interfering with an enforcement action. And so that's where some of the big things that came up in Minneapolis was people going, this is wrong. I'm here and it would be wrong for me to do nothing. And so they went and tried to interfere to stop something that they viewed as being wrong. But that was interfering with someone who has the lawful authority to do what they were doing, even if you looked at it and said, this is actually unjust.
So the government officials were in the right because they were exercising their authority as government officials, and the people who interfered with them thought they were also on the right side, and they were doing what they viewed as best, regardless of whether or not it was legal. And the situation devolved from that conflict and ended in the unfortunate circumstances. Some people would call it a tragedy. I've heard people saying that it's what happens when somebody makes a decision like that. And I think it's good to summarize, regardless of whether or not it was in the bounds of the law, at the end of the day, we need to remember that a life was lost, regardless of whether or not the officers were right or the the victim was right. A life was lost, and that's awful.
That is a tragedy.
So
the loss of life is something that should always be viewed as regrettable. It's the reality of living in a broken, sinful, fallen world, right? That's not how it's supposed to be. And so, regardless of what side you come down on the policy side of this, there should be agreement that's saying it is tragic that someone died. Okay.
Yes.
That's never a good, as it were. That said, the other thing we need to think about, and this is something that's really important, is that law enforcement is not kind of a monolithic thing. It's a bunch of individuals who have sworn oaths and obligations to follow the law. And what gets complicated, and has historically always been a complicated thing, is when a order is given, and if you are charged with carrying out that order, and you're like, I'm not entirely sure that is in fact the right order. And that's something that anytime you work in a chain of command, you have to understand that aspect to it. And there is at least some debate happening right now as to how lawful or correct some of these orders are being given. The problem is when you don't know. And we've seen this happen before, and this is common throughout history of many countries. So sometimes you end up getting an order and you're like, I don't have a way to independently verify if this order is correct or not. Assuming you can't say it's not correct, you follow the order. But understand that there's a place for having that kind of basically leveling, comparing it against other orders. So, for example, there's reports out right now that says that ICE is currently working with two different rules. One is the published training standards, and one of them is this memo regarding how they use the warrantless, not warrantless, the administrative warrants, and those are actually in conflict. I don't know if it is or not. I haven't read it. Okay, those aren't publicly accessible, but that would be a place where you have a problem within the entity that needs to be addressed. The other thing that should be probably recognized here is that it is very, very common, and most people never like running into this reality, but they are right now, is that often most governments do not exercise all the powers they have. They often say, this is my power, and I'm going to use this much of it, not that much of it, right? And that's good. We don't really need to be at full tilt to use every ability and authority we have all the time. But at the same time, sometimes those do occasion that can be very, very jarring because people forget that they actually do have that much authority rather than just this much like we're accustomed to seeing. That has definitely been on display here many, many times because as a rule, there is at least some aspects that we're looking at here that is probably legal but unexpected, which generates a response that can be particularly well, that's not how we normally do it. That's true. It's not how we normally do it. We don't normally do a lot of different things like this, but there are actually legal authorities, authorizations to do things that we do not commonly see in society. And so anytime you see the government acting in a way that is not normative, even if it's legal, it is not uncommon to provoke a response that may be very appropriate. Just because because it should also be remembered, just because the government has the power does not mean that it in fact is good, or that it should have that power, or that it's using it rightly. Just because something is legal does not mean that it's right. And just because something is illegal doesn't mean it's not moral. Okay, those morality and legal, lawful are we want those to be as harmonized as possible. But let's recognize that in this world they are not always harmonized. That has been a fundamental understanding Christians have had for a long, long, long time. Okay, but that being said, I think we are accustomed to wanting to see those synergized, and that doesn't always happen.
So, with that in mind, that's a really good takeaway for the whole situation, is that in this fallen world, we don't always see the harmonization of lawful and moral. What are some other principles that you guys could maybe elaborate? What are two, maybe three more principles that we should really hold in our minds as we leave this, because as we come away from the situation? Because in all likelihood, even though the administration might have learned something from this action, there's still a likelihood that it could happen again. So what are some things that we should take away from this tragedy, from this government action, from these protests? What is something that when we hear about things stirring again, we can go, we should think about this?
I think one of the lessons here, and this requires backing up a little bit, but understand that decisions have consequences. And that sounds really lame to say it that way, but I'm not talking about the decision to protest here. I'm actually referencing the fact that we have a prior problem in Minnesota that apparently seems to involve, or the accusation seems to involve, a lot of fraud of U.S. funds, okay, and state funds, okay, but federal and state funding that was apparently perpetuated by, at least in some parts, communities or groups of people that were presumptively not here legally. That is, again, there's a series of assumptions there that I can't prove to you whether they're true or not. But at least judging from public comment and response, it seems that part of the reason that this was focused here was twofold. One, the state was very resistant to do anything to clean up or address the fraud. There was an element of denying it. And local law enforcement was directed to not assist federal law enforcement when it comes to immigration law. They have a choice whether they wish to do that or not, and they were directed to it in a specific way. That resulted in an overtly federal interaction, which honestly is usually a less nuanced tool. As a rule, local law enforcement and local police and local government is going to best mesh with their community. They tend to have the best in engagement with them and understanding what's going to work and what's not going to work to be able to accomplish certain ends. When that nuance is removed and it is DC dropping into a local community, we're no longer using nuance. We're painting with very broad brushes and broad sweeping actions. Okay? That breakdown in civil society, even amongst political opponents, let's be straight up, like the governor of Minnesota and the president of the United States are not friends, okay? They literally ran against each other in the last election. That said, they both have a sworn oath to enforce the law, okay? That breakdown there has, at least in part, trickled down to a mess that's come out here. Now, does that mean that they are personally responsible for the shootings and all the stuff that's happened here? It does not. It does not. But a commitment to civil society and doing their best to uphold their oath and follow the law, even when you don't always like all the pieces of it, and working in some sort of harmony and community, I think could have prevented some of the tragedies we've seen of late. So I think there's a lesson there. If you don't deal with smaller problems, they eventually become bigger problems, and eventually those really big problems involve big dramatic actions. And those often have a lot of, although they're very appealing because they're big and dramatic in one sense for people that are ordering them, that doesn't always mean they're going to work out the way you want them to. And there was a fair bit of that we saw there. I think the other principle is that Americans do, and this is probably maybe a takeaway, not a principle, Americans do in fact value due process. And we believe that people should be given, they should be treated as innocent or proven guilty. And that's good. That is in fact a qualitative good thing for society to hold and remember to hold. Because if you go back a little bit, it's been not too long where we've had Democrats and Republicans on opposite sides of these lines, each using law enforcement with a presumption of, well, obviously you need to do it our way, and you don't get to argue the other in a variety of circumstances. I would argue that in both cases, that's wrong. That we should start with that innocent, proven guilty in all those circumstances. And I don't think either party is going to be making significant gains with the American public when they skip that principle, which is kind of baked into our country's DNA. And honestly, it's been tested of late, and there's been a lot of people going, no, there's actually something wrong with that. And it creates problems when you don't bother to follow it. Glenn, what else?
Yeah, so one of the big ones to me that has been evident through everything that's been going on in Minnesota, but also has been an issue that I've seen for a while, is we as American citizens tend to be really quick to judge things based on how we want it to turn out or what we want to be true. And then we go into anything and we look at a video and it proves what we want to be true, which is why you can have people who look at the same video of either of these shootings that happened and can have two very different takeaways of what it was, because one group can want to look at it and go, ICE is right, they're law enforcement, they're doing important missional work, and therefore you're looking at the video and you're kind of predisposed to see it in the best light for the ICE agents. Or people who look at ICE and go, they're coming in, they're terrorizing our streets, they're just rounding up people, and they're these horrible people. And so right away you're looking at the video with the idea that the ICE agents are in the wrong. And surprise, surprise, at the end of the day, watching the video, whichever side you went into that watching that video looking for turns out to be the confirmation, like that video is confirmation of what you wanted it to be. And we are very quick to hear something, jump to a conclusion, and then interpret all the facts in light of our conclusion and what we want to be true or what we think should be true, instead of slowing down, taking time to let's get all the facts that we can, and then see what is actually true and form our judgments based off of that. And I think we see that coming out of Minneapolis. We saw it with other things. A big example for me, in my mind, was the prosecutions of Donald Trump. We're very quick to jump to a conclusion and then interpret the facts through that conclusion and through those lenses, instead of actually looking at the facts and having the facts lead us into what is true. And I think, especially as Christians, we have to be looking for what is true, not what do I want to be true.
I think it should also probably be worth remembering that people of goodwill, good intent, and good character can land on different sides in this issue right now. I've got some friends of mine that are of the persuasion that you either have, at this point, it's the I can't be friends with you if you don't believe X or Y about the current circumstance, whatever it is. I would argue that is both biblically wrong, because we know that our Lord was friends with all sorts of people that society shunned, okay, for a variety of reasons, but also foolish because it precludes the fact that you could be wrong. And I think there's a certain level of humility that each of us need to carry that says, here's my best judgment about the facts I've seen as best I understand them. You know what? I could be in error. I think that's something that when we can say, we can believe them as fervently as we want, saying, as best I can, and I've done the research, and I've thought about this, and I've dug on this, and I believe X is true, and I can believe that fervently, and still not demonize someone for disagreeing with that. There are some positions where you're like, I'm sorry, there's like, for example, a biblical principle that is in play here, and someone's like straight up abrogating that and saying, no, that's not in fact good. Okay, fine. We can disagree with that and say they're in fact wrong, but particularly in matters of like a lack of clarity. I think you can come with good intention and good reason and find points of significant disagreement and still genuinely care for your brother or sister. And I think that's in fact something that our society needs more of. And it was something that traditionally was a hallmark of Christians, and very much that aspect needs to come into play in the current circumstance.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here in the studio today. It has been a pleasure to have you and to hear your thoughts. If you guys want to learn more about Project Pathfinder and what we do, you can always go to projectpathfinder.net, or you can email us at info@projectpathfinder.net for more information. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. We appreciate you. And until next time, this has been the Pathfinder Report. Have a wonderful day.